familiar concept of analysis in these episodes has been time in a page and time in panels. How does that work? How do you control it? And what are the attributes of it? League of Extraordinary Gentlemen by Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill often incorporates an interesting approach to this conundrum. So with a few pages from the first volume, I want to show you how Moore and O'Neill use full width panels and multiple points of focus within them to build in instances of time. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Haas, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So I like grids a lot, as formal elements that give a basis to build structure and pacing on top of. Alan Moore also, of course, liked grids, and League is no different. It uses a combination of the 6 grid, the 9 grid, and in a sort of roundabout way the 12 grid, at least in that there are 4 tiers in numerous cases, though the 12 grid itself is absent. In each of these cases, a single panel contains a sort of amount of time, either big or small. I won't spend too long setting this up because it's something I've discussed in previous episodes already, but essentially each panel can contain an action, and an action denotes time, along with dialogue too, but that's less visual. So if you have a panel in which someone runs down the street, that one action, that one focal element, denotes a single instance of time. And now that I've set that up, for the rest of the episode I will be referring to time instead as focal points. Because while time obviously doesn't quite exist in comics, focal points do, even though there's some kind of crossover in how you want to theorize those. And typically the more panels on a page, the more focal points you can fit into that page, and the less focal points you can fit into each panel. Just from a practical point, as the panels get smaller, the less you can kind of draw in there at a readable level. But similarly, the logic then argues that the lower the panel density, so the less panels you have in the page, the higher the instances of focus you can have in each of those. It's a solid argument actually, and one that Moore and O'Neill do explore within League. If you look at this 9-panel page, there's not really any instances where you could combine those panels, so it does make sense to format them in this way. You couldn't take the first tier and make it one image without doing some kind of visual trickery to show the character moving through the page, because it's actually just the same action being broken down numerous times. And that is the same for the rest of the page too, it's mostly just the same characters having a series of smaller interactions. The only way you could combine them is to add dialogue from one panel into another, and that just creates more text density but not more visual density, not more points of focus. Which brings up a facet of this, right? If you argue the point that bigger panels allow a greater opportunity for more points of focus, the page has to be built like that. You specifically have to write with that in mind, otherwise your panels will be bigger, but they won't contain more focal points. A recent example I'm thinking of is the new Warren Ellis and Brian Hitch Batman series, which is specifically designed around big panels with one point of focus, to make the action look particularly dynamic and dramatic, but also really fast paced. Because more instances of focal points typically means a slower read through a page, and therefore less means a quicker one. Let's take a look at this 6-panel grid for another example, right? Immediately you can see that there are less points of focus on the page because there are less panels. And actually that's not altogether true, I'm setting you up for a bit of a fall, because Moore and O'Neill work additional instances of focus, and in a way, technically additional panels. So the first panel has someone being thrown towards a mirror. A single action, a single instance of time, arguably, right? A single point of focus visually. But it also has a reflection in the mirror, which acts as a new panel and a new point of focus. Because now the panel is not just throwing someone towards a mirror, it's also showing us the character doing that action. And everything that goes along with that, right? The kind of lack of exertion, the simple toss, all the acting stuff. It's all contained in that mirror. So even though that's one overall panel, it contains 2 points of focus. And that's not just because it has 2 characters either, because the second panel arguably is a single point of focus, even though it contains multiple people. The point of focus here is the whole panel, right? The whole interaction, the character's holding a gun up to hide as he sees them. That's what the panel contains. It's not asking you to see those as 2 individual things. Which brings us to these pages with the 4 full width stack panels. To pull up that concept from before, each of these has the ability to contain a point of focus. And the bigger the panel, either the larger the scale of that point of focus, or alternatively, it comes the opportunity for scale to stay the same while the instances increase. If on one side you've got Hitch's Batman in a single instance, large and in charge as it were, and on the other end of that imaginary scale is this page, where each of these panels contains multiple instances of time because it contains multiple points of focus. That first panel essentially is recreated as 2 panels, one on the left with Hyde and the detective, and the other on the right with the characters watching and commenting on that scene. They're also cut off from each other visually thanks to the frame of the window that's present. And it's similar to an example from a page before that, where in the second panel, a character on the left causes attention and focus, while the conversation on the right happens. And once again, there's also sort of demarcation of the suggested panel, with the straight line of the wall that separates left from right, and a character that effectively sort of breaks the panel border almost by leaning from one into the other. You could easily split those 2 up as separate panels and see how clear that is as well. And it happens again on the final panel of that page, where a wall and a giant skull carving also creates a sort of separate panel on the right, and therefore a separate point of focus. And this concept of splitting up tiers carries on throughout this whole sequence in the museum, and it actually occurs almost every single time we see a page like this within League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Like on this page, which creates left and right pockets of focus in similar ways on the first two panels, and then for the latter two, uses a character in the middle to break up those separate visuals, and again, create two separate instances of focus. And it speaks to the intention of this, right? Because why present it in this way, rather than as actual separate panels? So what is the benefit of showing multiple framings and instances of focus within one longer panel? Well, like I alluded to with the panel of the character breaking the sort of faux panel border, it feels like one sweeping moment in practice rather than a cut-up one. When you see that as two panels, they are two very clearly distinct instances. And when you present them as Moore and O'Neill have, they become one sweeping moment made up of multiple points of focus. And it's a very specific distinction, right? Because it allows the moments to flow more freely than what we see in the 9 grid, which now, by comparison, seems almost jittery and nervous in the way it's broken up. In this way, we can almost see the scene develop in front of our eyes, right? The removal of gutters left to right also removing any sense of falseness, any sense of artifice from the actual product itself. The other practical reason is that these are scenes made up of multiple characters, and so they logically can be more spread out through the visual. But ultimately, it opens up each of these fragments of the scene to feel more naturalistic and less controlled, even though that's exactly what they are. To me, it's yet another clever approach from the toolbox of Moore and O'Neill in this series, and one that made me think differently when considering the dynamic of dialogue sequences with a larger cast. Rather than that constant sort of chopping back and forth between moments, which is powerful and specific in its own right, this is another way to balance and build dialogue that can completely change the dynamic of a scene and open up the moment and the focus and time in an entirely new way, and the way that is pure comics. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Pal or Naked, you can support the channel on Patreon, where you'll get access to years and years of exclusive writing and annotations. You can also find my Eisner-winning magazine at panelxpanel.com, and follow me on Twitter at HassanOE. Finally, hit subscribe and that notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I'll see you next time.